The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of cell block D. Sarah Blake sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her weathered hands folded in her lap, counting the hours until her execution. 3 days, 72 hours, 4,320 minutes. She had stopped counting the seconds long ago. 42. Sarah's auburn hair had dulled to a mousy brown, streaked with premature gray that caught the artificial light. Her once strong frame had grown thin during her 5 years on death row, but her green eyes still held the steel that had made her one of the military's most decorated canine handlers. Those same eyes had watched 12 other women walk the final corridor. Ahead of her, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence, Blake came the gravelly voice of Corrections Officer Martinez as his keys jangled against the metal bars. "Warden wants to see you." Sarah didn't move immediately. She had made her peace with death, or so she told herself. The appeals had been exhausted. The lawyers had given up. Even her own sister had stopped visiting after the second year, unable to reconcile the woman she'd known with the convicted murderer. The world saw, but there was one request Sarah had never made, one final wish she'd kept locked away because the hope would have killed her faster than any lethal injection. The warden's office smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic resignation. Warden Patricia Hayes looked up from her paperwork with tired eyes that had seen too many executions, too many last meals, too many final words that changed nothing. Sit. Don Blake. Sarah remained standing, her military bearing intact, despite the orange jumpsuit and shackles. "I want to make a request, Warden. 3 days before execution? Bit late for that, don't you think? I want to see my dog." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Warden Hayes set down her pen and studied Sarah's face, searching for signs of the breakdown she'd witnessed in so many others facing their final days. "Your dog, Ranger, he's a German Shepherd, retired military working dog. He should be about 10 years old now, living with a foster family in Richmond." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "I trained him. We served 3 tours together in Afghanistan. He saved my life more times than I can count." "Blake, you're scheduled for execution." "I know exactly when I'm scheduled to die," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm not asking for a stay. I'm not asking for anything except to see my partner one last time." Warden Hayes leaned back in her chair. In 15 years of overseeing executions, she'd heard every last request imaginable: final meals, visits from estranged relatives, letters to lovers, even requests for specific music during the procedure, but never a dog. "Given, if I wanted to grant this request, which I'm not saying I do, how would we even locate the animal?" "His foster family is the Morrison family in Richmond. Tom Morrison was Ranger's veterinarian during our service. He took him in after." Sarah's voice caught for the first time. "After I was arrested." The silence stretched between them. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, and somewhere in the prison, a door slammed with the finality of a coffin lid. "Why, Warden?" Hayes finally asked. "Why now? Why him?" Sarah met her eyes, and for a moment the hardened criminal facade cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Because he's the only thing left in this world that knows who I really am. Not the woman who supposedly murdered Colonel James Mitchell in cold blood. Not the killer the newspapers wrote about. He knows Sarah Blake, the woman who used to sneak him extra treats after particularly hard missions, the woman who held him when he got shot by insurgent fire in Kandahar, the woman who would have died for him without hesitation." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And maybe, if I can see him one more time, I can remember who that woman was before I die." Warden Hayes had seen hardened killers break down in her office. She'd watched stone-cold murderers weep for their mothers, but there was something different about Sarah Blake's request, something that felt less like desperation and more like hopeful. "Make some calls," she said finally. "No promises." Sarah nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement. "Thank you, Warden." As Sarah was led back to her cell, Warden Hayes picked up her phone. She told herself it was professional curiosity that made her dial Tom Morrison's number, but deep down she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to Sarah Blake's story than the courts had been willing to hear. 2 hours later, Tom Morrison answered his phone. On the third ring, his voice was older, more weathered than Warden Hayes had expected. "Mr. Morrison, this is Warden Hayes from Virginia State Correctional Facility. I'm calling about a German Shepherd named Ranger." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Hayes wondered if the call had been dropped. "Is this about Sarah?" Morrison's voice was barely audible. "You know about Tuv?" "Of course, I know about Sarah Blake. Every night for 5 years I've watched that dog stare at the front door waiting for someone who's never coming home." Morrison's voice grew stronger, edged with an anger that surprised Hayes. "What do you want?" "Ms. Blake has requested to see Ranger before her execution. I'm calling to see if bring her to him." "I'm sorry. I said bring her to him. Don't you dare put that dog through the trauma of your prison. If Sarah wants to see Ranger, she can see him here in his home where he's safe." Hayes found herself taken aback by the man's vehemence. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concerns, but security protocols don't allow." "Then your security protocols are going to deny a dying woman her last wish." Morrison cut her off. "I've been a veterinarian for 37 years, Warden. I've seen a lot of bonds between humans and animals. But what Sarah and Ranger had, he paused and Hayes could hear him take a shaky breath. I've never seen anything like it. That dog hasn't been the same since she left. What do you mean? He doesn't play anymore, barely eats. He used to love going on walks, playing fetch, all the normal dog things, but ever since Sarah was arrested, he just exists. He goes through the motions of being alive, but his spirit is broken. My wife and I, we've done everything we can, but we're not who he's waiting for. Hayes felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she thought she'd buried after years of managing executions. Mr. Morrison, even if I could arrange transport the liability issues alone. 5 years, Morrison interrupted. For 5 years, that dog has been in mourning. For a woman who's still alive, are you really going to deny them both this chance? After she hung up the phone, Warden Hayes sat in her office staring at Sarah Blake's file. The case had been straightforward enough on the surface. Colonel James Mitchell, Sarah's commanding officer, found dead in his office from a single gunshot to the chest. Sarah's service weapon, her fingerprints on the gun, her presence at the scene. She'd claimed innocence, insisted she'd found Mitchell already dead. But the evidence had been overwhelming still. Something had always bothered Hayes about the case. Sarah Blake had been a decorated soldier, a woman who'd risked her life countless times to serve her country. The psychological profile suggested no propensity for violence outside of combat situations. Her service record was spotless, her character references glowing, but evidence was evidence, and Sarah Blake had been convicted by a jury of her peers now. 3 days before her execution, she wanted to see her dog. Hayes picked up her phone again. This time she called the transport division. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right that night. Sarah lay on her cot staring at the ceiling. She could hear the other women on death row, talking quietly in their cells, their voices carrying the weight of their own approaching endings. Some were sleeping, others like her were counting 3 days. 71 hours and 43 minutes. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember. Ranger, as a young dog barely 2 years old, all energy and enthusiasm and boundless loyalty. Their first mission together, how he'd pressed close to her side during the helicopter ride, sensing her nervousness, the way he'd looked at her after their first successful bomb detection, tail wagging, eyes bright with the joy of a job well done, the way he'd winned when they took her away in handcuffs, straining against Tom Morrison's grip, trying to follow the police car as it pulled away. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah Blake allowed herself to cry. Not for her approaching death, but for the dog who was still waiting for her to come home. In a house 30 miles away, Ranger lifted his head from his bed and looked toward the front door. Something had changed. Something in the air and the rhythm of the world around him. His handler was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The call came at 6:23 a.m., jarring Tom Morrison from the first decent sleep he'd had in weeks. Warden Hayes' voice was crisp, professional, but he could hear something else underneath. Perhaps reluctance, perhaps hope. Mr. Morrison, I've spoken with the state authorities. We can arrange for Ms. Blake to visit Ranger tomorrow afternoon. There will be significant security measures in place, but if you're still willing to host this meeting. Tom looked down at Ranger, who was already sitting at attention beside the bed. Ears perked. It was as if the dog had been waiting for this call for 5 years. We'll be ready, Tom said. Across town, Sarah Blake was experiencing her own awakening. Not from sleep, she hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since her sentencing, but from the numbness that had protected her for so long. Guard Martinez had delivered the news with uncharacteristic gentleness. Tomorrow, she would see Ranger 4 to 7 hours. She whispered to herself 2 days until execution, but tomorrow, she would see her partner. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah found herself remembering details she'd forced herself to forget. The way Ranger's ears would twitch when he heard her voice from across a compound, how he'd position himself between her and any perceived threat without being commanded. The night in Kandahar when shrapnel from an IED had torn through her Kevlar vest and Ranger had refused to leave her side even as medics worked to stop the bleeding. But the memories that surfaced weren't all comforting. The darker ones came to the ones she'd buried deepest. The last night she'd seen Ranger before her arrest. He'd been restless that evening, whining softly, pressing against her legs as if trying to tell her so. Should have listened to him then. The next afternoon arrived with Virginia's October chill cutting through the air. Sarah sat in the back of the transport van, shackled at the wrists and ankles, flanked by 2 armed guards. The world outside the tinted windows looked foreign after 5 years of concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. Trees heavy with autumn foliage, children playing in front yards, normal people living normal lives. Morrison's house was a modest 2-story, colonial with a fenced backyard. As the van pulled into the driveway, Sarah could see a figure watching from behind the kitchen curtains, a woman with graying hair. Tom's wife Linda, she assumed, but no sign of Ranger standard protocol. Guard Matthews informed her as they prepared to exit the vehicle, "We'll sweep the house first, then bring you in. Any sudden movements, any attempt to flee, and this visit ends immediately." Sarah knotted her throat too tight to speak. After 5 years of dreaming about this moment, she was terrified it wouldn't live up to her memories. What if Ranger had forgotten her? What if the dog she remembered no longer existed? Tom Morrison met them at the front door. He was older than Sarah had expected, perhaps 70, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working with animals. His gaze found Sarah immediately studying her face with the same careful attention he'd once given to her dog's injury. "Miss Blake," he said simply. "Ranger's in the backyard. He's been waiting by the gate since dawn." The security sweep took 20 minutes. Sarah sat in the van watching the guards move through the house, checking windows and doors, ensuring there were no weapons, no escape routes, no threats to their prisoner. It all seemed so absurd. Where exactly did they think she was going to run? She had 2 days to live, and the only thing keeping her sane was the promise of seeing her dog finally. Matthews returned to the van. "All clear, remember Blake? One wrong move, and we're gone." The back door of the Morrison house opened onto a modest yard surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence. Sarah stepped through the doorway and the world-stopped stranger was lying near the back gate, his massive head resting on his paws. At the sound of the door opening, he lifted his head and his dark eyes met hers across the yard. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The dog's once pristine coat had dulled with age, and Sarah could see the gray around his muzzle, the slight stiffness in his movements as he rose to his feet, but his eyes, those intelligent, loyal, heartbreakingly familiar eyes, were exactly as she remembered. "Ranger," she whispered. The sound of her voice broke whatever spell had held them both frozen. Ranger's ears shot forward, his tail began a tentative wag, and then he was moving toward her with the determined gait of a dog who had never stopped believing this day would come. The guards tensed hands, moving toward their weapons, but Tom Morrison stepped forward. "He's not aggressive, he's just," he remembers. Ranger reached Sarah and stopped just inches away, looking up at her with an expression that was almost human in its complexity. Joy, relief, confusion, and something else, a deep abiding sadness that made Sarah's chest ache. "Hello boy," she said softly, and that was all it took. Ranger pressed his head against her knees with the same motion he'd used 1,000 times before when they were both young and whole and believed the world made sense. Sarah's shackled hands could only reach so far, but she managed to touch his head, to run her fingers through the coarse fur behind his ears. The dog's entire body seemed to sag with relief. He leaned into her touch, and Sarah could feel the tremors running through his frame, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of reunion. Guard Matthews shifted uncomfortably. "Blake, we need to keep this moving. Let them have a moment." Tom Morrison's voice cut through the official protocol like a blade. "Do you have any idea what you're witnessing here?" Sarah sank to her knees, bringing herself closer to Ranger's level. The movement was awkward with the shackles, but Ranger seemed to understand. He moved closer, pressing his entire body against her, his head now level with her shoulder. "Sorry boy," she whispered into his fur. "I'm so sorry. I left you." Ranger's response was a low whine, not of distress but of acknowledgement. His tail wagged slowly, as if he was afraid too much movement might break the spell and make her disappear again. But then something shifted. Ranger's posture changed, his head lifting to look around the yard, his nostrils flared, and Sarah felt his muscles tense beneath her hands. He was scenting something, searching for what? Hard. Matthews stepped closer, and Ranger's head snapped toward him. The dog's hackles didn't rise, but Sarah felt the change in his demeanor. He was assessing, categorizing, filing away information in that remarkable canine brain. Then Ranger turned to guard Collins, who stood near the back door. Same behavior, careful observation, scenting analysis. But when his attention moved to the third guard, Officer Bradley, something changed. Ranger's ears flattened slightly, not in aggression, but in recognition of something that disturbed him. He moved partially in front of Sarah, not quite a protective stance, but close enough to send a message. "Easy boy," Sarah murmured, but she was watching too. In their years of service together, she'd learned to read Ranger's signals as clearly as a written report. Something about Officer Bradley was triggering memories. Tom Morrison noticed the change as well. "Is everything all right?" Officer Bradley laughed nervously. "Just an old dog, being territorial. They get confused at this age." But Ranger wasn't confused. His training was coming back. The behaviors Sarah had drilled into him during countless hours of practice. He was alerting to something, trying to communicate information he couldn't put into words. Mind began to race. Ranger had been with her the night Colonel Mitchell died. He'd been in the corridor outside Mitchell's office while she'd gone in for their scheduled meeting when she'd found Mitchell's body and stumbled backward in shock. Ranger had appeared at her side, instantly reading her distress, but there had been someone else in the building that night, someone whose scent Ranger would have logged, cataloged, remembered, with the perfect recall that made military working dogs so valuable. She said softly, testing her theory, "Who's here, boy? Do you remember?" The dog's attention focused entirely on Officer Bradley, who was now shifting uncomfortably under the animal's intense stare. Ranger took a step toward the guard, nostrils flaring, and Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. "Ma'am, we need to wrap this up," Bradley said, his voice tight. "Security protocols. What's your first name?" "Officer Bradley," Sarah asked. Suddenly, the guard blinked, caught off guard. "Why would you? Just curious. 5 years on death row, you start to wonder about the people who watch over you." "Marcus," he said. After a moment, "Marcus Bradley." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. Marcus Bradley, she knew that name, not from the prison but from before, from the military personnel files she'd seen in Colonel Mitchell's office. Marcus Bradley had been a military police officer at Fort Braxton. He'd been investigated for corruption, suspected of selling information to civilian contractors. And Colonel Mitchell had been building a case against him. Ranger was still staring at Bradley, his body language growing more agitated by the minute. The dog remembered this man, remembered his scent from that night, 5 years ago. Tom, Sarah said carefully, not taking her eyes off Ranger, could you call Warden Hayes? Tell her there's been a development, Blake. What the hell are you doing? Matthews demanded, following my dog's lead. Sarah replied, just like I was trained to do. Ranger suddenly sat, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Officer Bradley. It was a formal alert position, the same stance he'd taken hundreds of times when he'd detected explosives or contraband. He was telling Sarah, in the only way he could, that this man was significant. This man was dangerous. This man had been there the night Colonel Mitchell died. Officer Bradley's hand moved toward his weapon. This is ridiculous. We're leaving now. No, Tom Morrison said firmly, stepping between Bradley and the back door. I think we're going to wait right here until someone can explain why my dog is treating you like a threat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. As the standoff developed, Sarah remained on her knees beside Ranger, her mind working furiously to process the implications of what she was witnessing. Her dog, her partner, her fellow soldier, was trying to solve the case that had condemned her to death, and he'd found the real killer. The tension in Tom Morrison's backyard was thick enough to cut. With a knife, Ranger remained in his alert position, every muscle in his aging body focused on Officer Bradley with laser precision. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle began clicking into place. Tom, please, she said quietly, never taking her eyes off Bradley. Make that call, Tom. Morrison had spent 40 years reading the body language of animals in distress, and what he saw in Ranger's posture made his blood run cold. This wasn't an old dog having a senior moment. This was a highly trained military working dog identifying a threat. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed Warden Hayes' direct number. This is getting out of hand, Guard Matthews interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. He too was watching Ranger's behavior with growing unease. Military working dogs didn't make mistakes. They didn't false alert. If Ranger was saying Bradley was significant, then Bradley was significant. Hayes, here came the warden's voice through Tom's phone. Speaker, Warden, this is Tom Morrison. You need to get someone out here immediately. The dog is alerting on one of your guards. What do you mean alerting? Sarah spoke up, her voice carrying across the yard with military authority. Warden Hayes, this is Sarah. Blake. Ranger is displaying formal alert behavior toward Officer Marcus Bradley. In our training, this indicates recognition of a significant threat or target. Officer Bradley let out a forced laugh. This is insane. You're all taking the word of a dog over. Shut up, Bradley, Matthews said suddenly. His own hand was now resting on his weapon, but it wasn't pointed at Sarah. It was positioned to draw on his fellow officer if necessary. Hayes, what do you want us to do? Through the phone speaker, they could hear the warden taking rapid notes. Morrison, can you keep everyone there? I'm sending Detective Rivera from the state police. ETA 15 minutes. Will be here, Tom confirmed. The wait stretched like a century. Sarah remained on her knees beside Ranger, who had not moved from his alert position. The dog's focus was unwavering, his training overriding any confusion or anxiety about the situation. This was what he had been bred for, trained for, lived for, to detect threats and protect. His handler, Linda Morrison, appeared in the kitchen window, her face pale with concern. Tom caught her eye and shook his head slightly. Stay inside, let this play out. Officer Bradley was sweating despite the October chill. This is harassment based on the behavior of an animal. You can't seriously. Marcus Bradley, Fort Braxton Military Police. 2018 to 2019, Sarah said suddenly. You were under investigation for selling classified information to civilian contractors Colonel Mitchell was building the case against you. Bradley's face went white. How could you possibly? Because I saw your file on Mitchell's desk the night he died, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You were supposed to be arrested the following week, but someone killed Mitchell before he could finalize the charges. Ranger's tail twitched once, not a wag, but an acknowledgement that his handler was on the right track. The dog had been trying to tell her this for 5 years, and finally she was listening. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the standoff. Detective Rivera was early, or perhaps he'd been closer than expected. Either way, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and terror wash over her. In less than 36 hours, she was scheduled to die if this didn't work. Blake Matthews said quietly, you better be right about this. See him, not the one you need to worry about being right, Sarah replied, stroking Ranger's head. He is, and he's never been wrong. Detective Rivera arrived with backup, 2 state police cruisers, and a forensics van that suggested Warden Hayes had taken this development very seriously indeed. Rivera himself was a compact man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. He surveyed the scene in the backyard, a death row inmate in shackles kneeling beside a German shepherd who was staring fixedly at a prison guard. Under normal circumstances it would have seemed absurd, but Rivera had worked with canine units before. He knew what a trained alert looked like. "Ms. Blake," he said, approaching cautiously, "I understand you have some information about your case, detective. 5 years ago, Ranger was with me in the building where Colonel Mitchell was murdered. Military working dogs are trained to remember and identify specific scents associated with significant events." Sarah's voice was steady now, falling into the crisp cadence of a briefing. "Ranger is alerting on Officer Bradley because he recognizes his scent from..." That night Rivera turned to Bradley, who was now visibly shaking. "Officer Bradley, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." "This is ridiculous," Bradley protested, but his voice cracked. "You're taking the word of a convicted murderer and..." "A dog over..." "Actually," Rivera interrupted, pulling out his phone, "I'm taking the word of a decorated military working dog whose testimony has been accepted in federal court 17 times. Ranger's alerts have never been overturned on appeal." Felt tears streaming down her face. For 5 years, she'd known she was innocent but had been unable to prove it. Now her partner, her loyal, incredible partner, was providing the evidence that could save her life. But there was more. Ranger's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, and Sarah recognized the signs he wasn't finished alerting. There was something else he was trying to communicate. "Detective," she said, "Ranger's telling us there's more. He's trained to detect multiple threats, multiple pieces of evidence. You need to search." "Bradley, now, wait just a minute." Bradley started to back toward the gate. "Marcus Bradley, you're under arrest," Rivera announced, motioning to his backup officers. "You have the right to remain silent." Search of Bradley's person revealed a small recording device hidden in his radio pack, a device that had been recording every conversation in the Morrison backyard. But it was what they found in his car that broke the case wide open. A Springfield .45 pistol, the same caliber weapon that had killed Colonel Mitchell. Ballistics would later confirm it was the murder weapon. As Bradley was led away in handcuffs, Ranger finally relaxed his alert posture. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time since she'd been arrested, his tail wagged freely. Not the tentative wag of their reunion, but the enthusiastic celebration of a mission accomplished. "Good boy," Sarah whispered, wrapping her arms around him as much as her shackles would allow. "Such a good boy. You solved it, Ranger. You solved the whole thing, detective." Rivera knelt beside them, his own eyes bright with emotion. "Ms. Blake, I'm going to call the DA immediately. With this new evidence and Bradley's arrest, I'm confident your execution will be stayed pending a full investigation." Sarah buried her face in Ranger's fur, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to live. Her partner had spent 5 years waiting to tell his side of the story, and when he finally got the chance, he'd saved her life. As they waited for the legal machinery to begin moving, Tom Morrison brought out a bowl of water for Ranger and a cup of coffee for Sarah. The dog drank deeply, then settled beside his handler with a contentment that had been missing for 5 long years. "You know," Tom said quietly, "I always wondered why he never gave up hope. Now I understand." He knew the truth, and he was just waiting for someone to listen. Hera looked down at Ranger, who was finally resting peacefully at her side. "Military working dogs are trained never to abandon their mission," she said. "His mission was to protect me even when I couldn't protect myself." The phone call from the governor's office came 3 hours later. Sarah Blake's execution was officially stayed, and a full investigation into the murder of Colonel Mitchell would be reopened immediately. But Sarah barely heard the details. She was too busy watching Ranger chase a tennis ball that Linda Morrison had brought outside. The first time in 5 years that anyone had seen the old dog play. Her partner had brought her back from the dead. Now it was time for both of them to remember how to live. The execution chamber at Virginia State Correctional Facility had been prepared with clinical efficiency. The gurney was positioned under harsh fluorescent lights for lines-ready witnesses gathering in the observation room. Behind bulletproof glass in 18 minutes, Sarah Blake was scheduled to die by lethal injection, but 18 minutes earlier the world had changed. Marcus Bradley's confession had come at 11:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before Sarah's scheduled midnight execution. He'd been brought to the facility in shackles, flanked by Detective Rivera and 2 federal marshals, his face pale with the knowledge that he was about to save a woman's life by destroying his own. Warden Hayes stood in the corridor outside the execution chamber, her phone pressed against her ear as she spoke rapidly with the governor's office. 30 feet away behind a steel door, Sarah Blake lay strapped to the gurney, waiting for the chemicals that would stop her heart. "Yes, sir, I understand the gravity of the situation," Hayes was saying, "but we have a full confession from the actual perpetrator corroborated by physical evidence. If we proceed with this execution, the state will be committing murder." Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the urgency in the movements of the medical personnel around her. Something had changed. The routine efficiency of her execution had been disrupted by something. "What's happening?" she asked the technician who was checking her foreline. "For the 3rd time in 5 minutes, I don't know, ma'am," he replied honestly. "Just waiting for word from the warden 3 floors below, in an interview room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and fear." Marcus Bradley was providing details of a murder he'd committed 5 years earlier. Detective Rivera recorded every word while federal prosecutors took notes, building the case that would eventually dismantle an entire corruption network. I didn't plan to kill him, Bradley was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. I was just supposed to steal the files, destroy his evidence, but Mitchell came back to his office early. He found me there. So, you shot him? Rivera prompted. Thompson told me to. He was on the radio listening to everything when Mitchell started to call security. Thompson said there was no choice. He said, if Mitchell lived, we'd all go to prison for treason. The confession continued for 17 more minutes, each detail another nail in the coffin of Sarah Blake's wrongful conviction. Bradley described how they'd used Sarah's security codes to enter the building, how they'd stolen her service weapon from the armory, how they'd waited until her scheduled meeting with Mitchell to stage the murder. We knew she'd be alone with him. Bradley admitted we knew she'd have no witnesses, no alibi. Thompson said it was perfect. A subordinate killing a superior officer. The military would want it resolved quickly and quietly. At 11:58 p.m., Warden Hayes received the call she'd been waiting for. The governor had issued a stay of execution, effective immediately. Sarah Blake would live. The warden burst through the doors of the execution chamber like an avenging angel, her usually composed demeanor shattered by the urgency of the moment. Stop. She shouted to the medical team, stop everything. We have a stay. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. After 5 years of appeals and legal battles, after accepting that she would die for a crime she hadn't committed, she was being given another chance at life with less than 2 minutes to Zaramem, the lead technician, asked, his hand frozen over the 4 controls removed. The lines. Hayes ordered all of them. Ms. Blake is no longer scheduled for execution. As the medical team began disconnecting the apparatus of death, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of relief. Not yet. She was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this reprieve was real. Warden, she managed to say through her tears, is it over? Am I? You're alive, Sarah Hayes replied, using her first name for the first time in 5 years. And if the confession we just heard is accurate, you're going home. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and legal maneuvering. Sarah was moved from the execution chamber to a holding cell while prosecutors worked through the night to process Bradley's confession and the mountain of evidence that supported it. Detective Rivera appeared at her cell door. As dawn was breaking over the prison walls, he looked exhausted but triumphant, his shirt wrinkled, his tie askew from a night spent documenting the confession that would set an innocent woman free. Sarah, he said, pulling up a chair outside her cell, I need to tell you what we've learned over the next hour. Rivera laid out the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. The corruption network had been vast, involving military personnel, civilian contractors, and even some members of Congress who had received campaign contributions in exchange for favorable defense contracts. Colonel Mitchell wasn't just investigating Bradley, Rivera explained. He'd uncovered evidence of systematic fraud that went all the way up to the Pentagon. They killed him to protect billions of dollars in illegal profits. Sarah listened in stunned silence as the detective described how she'd been selected as the perfect fall guy. A female soldier with access to Mitchell's office, no family connections to raise uncomfortable questions, and a psychological profile that suggested she might crack under the pressure of military life. They studied you, Sarah. They knew your routine, your security clearances, even your emotional triggers. The frame-up wasn't improvised. It was calculated, but the most shocking revelation was still to come. There was a fourth person involved, Rivera continued. Someone who helped coordinate the whole operation from the outside. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Who? Your defense attorney, Marcus Hoffman. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Hoffman had been appointed by the court to represent her, had sat across from her for months during trial preparation, had looked her in the eyes while promising to prove her innocence, all while working to ensure her conviction. He sabotaged your defense from the inside, Rivera explained, refused to pursue military connections, discouraged character witnesses, even advised you not to testify on your own behalf. He was paid nearly $500,000 to make sure you went down for Mitchell's murder. Sarah felt years of suppressed rage finally exploding inside her chest. I trusted him. I believed he was trying to help me. He played his role perfectly, even threw in enough effort to make it look legitimate, filing appeals that he knew would fail, raising objections that he knew were meaningless. You never had a real defense, Sarah. You never had a chance. Devastating as these revelations were, they also provided Sarah with something she'd lacked for 5 years, answers. The seemingly inexplicable failure of her legal defense, the reluctance of military witnesses to testify, the mountain of circumstantial evidence that had buried her. It all made sense. Now she hadn't failed to prove her innocence, she'd been systematically prevented from doing so. What happens to them? She asked finally. Bradley will probably get life without parole in exchange for his cooperation. Thompson is looking at similar charges. Hoffman will likely face disbarment in federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Rivera paused, studying Sarah's face carefully before continuing. But there's something else you should know. Something about Ranger. Sarah's heart clenched. Is he okay? He's more than okay. Tom Morrison told me something interesting when I called to update him on the case. He said Ranger has been different since your execution was stayed. More alert, more energetic. Like he knew something had changed. The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sarah, I've worked with canine units for 15 years. I've never seen anything like what Ranger did in that backyard. He didn't just identify Bradley, he built the case that saved your life, as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of barking echoed through the prison corridors. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart racing with recognition. Ranger. The barking grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of dog tags and the sound of running paws on concrete. Then Tom Morrison's voice, breathless with exertion. Sorry, he got away from me. He saw the prison van in the parking lot and well, he knew Ranger burst into view, dragging his leash behind him, his entire body vibrating with excitement. When he saw Sarah sitting in her cell, he planted himself in front of the bars and let out a howl of pure joy that echoed through the entire cell block. Hello boy, Sarah whispered, reaching through the bars to touch his head. Did you hear the good news? Hear the good news? Ranger's tail wagged so hard his entire back end wiggled. He pressed his head against the bars, straining to get as close to Sarah as possible, his dark eyes bright with an emotion that looked remarkably like relief. The paperwork should be finalized within the hour, Detective Rivera said, standing to leave. You're going home today, Sarah, both of you. As Rivera and Tom Morrison stepped aside to discuss the logistics of Sarah's release, she remained kneeling by her cell door, her fingers tangled in Ranger's fur through the bars. The dog had never stopped believing in her innocence, never stopped waiting for her return. Now finally the wait was over. We did it, boy, she whispered. We're going home. 3 weeks later, Sarah Blake found herself in an impossible position, alive but still imprisoned, while the legal system slowly ground through the process of overturning her conviction. Marcus Bradley had confessed to killing Colonel Mitchell, but bureaucracy moved at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of human lives hanging in the balance. The stay of execution had bought her time, but she was still technically a condemned woman. Warden Hayes had moved Sarah to a different cell block away from death row, but not yet into general population. She existed in a legal limbo, sustained only by daily phone calls from Detective Rivera, updating her on the investigation's progress. Bradley's lawyer is trying to work out a plea deal, Rivera told her during their morning call, but the DA wants him to allocate to provide details about the murder and any co-conspirators. This wasn't a spur-of-a-moment crime. Sarah Mitchell's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that went deep into the military procurement system. Sarah pressed the phone against her ear, hungry for every detail. How deep? Deep enough that someone was willing to kill a decorated colonel to keep it quiet. Bradley was just the triggerman. We think there were others involved in the decision. The investigation had revealed that Colonel Mitchell had been close to exposing a ring of military personnel who were selling intelligence and equipment manifests to private contractors. The profits ran into the millions, and the security breaches had potentially cost lives in active combat zones. Bradley had been facing not just court-martial but federal charges that could have put him away for life. When he'd learned that Mitchell planned to present evidence to the Joint Chiefs the following week, he'd panicked, but someone had helped him plan the murder. Someone had provided him with Sarah's duty, schedule her service, weapon access codes, even the timing of when she'd be alone with Mitchell. The frame-up had been too perfect to be Question was, who? Sarah's answer came from an unexpected source. Ranger Tom Morrison had been bringing the dog to visit her twice a week. With Warden Hayes' permission, the visits were technically still security risks, but the warden had witnessed what happened when a highly trained dog provided evidence that exonerated a wrongly convicted person. She wasn't taking any chances with Sarah Blake's case. During Ranger's fourth visit, something extraordinary happened. They were in the same yard where Bradley had been arrested, Sarah kneeling beside Ranger while Tom Morrison watched from the porch. The dog seemed more relaxed now, no longer carrying the weight of an unsolved mission. He played fetch, accepted treats, even dozed in the afternoon sun, all behaviors that had been absent for 5 years. But when a new guard appeared to escort Sarah back to her cell, Ranger's demeanor changed instantly. The guard was older, perhaps 55, with the bearing of a career military man. He wore the uniform of a senior corrections officer, and his nameplate read Thompson. Sarah had never seen him before, but Ranger had the dog's ears flattened against his head, and he moved to position himself between Sarah and the new guard, not the formal alert he'd shown with Bradley. This was different. This was personal. Easy boy, Thompson said with a nervous laugh. I'm just here to escort the prisoner. But Ranger wasn't having it. He began a low growl, deep in his chest, and his hackles rose along his spine. Sarah felt the fur on her own arms stand up in response to the dog's warning tone. She said quietly, call Detective Rivera. Mom, that's not necessary, Thompson protested, but his voice carried the same strain Sarah had heard in Bradley's voice 3 weeks earlier. The dog's just protective. No, Sarah said, her own training kicking in. He's not protective, he's identifying a threat. Tom Morrison was already dialing his phone, the number for Detective Rivera was now stored in his favorites, a grim reminder of how their lives had been turned upside down by murder and conspiracy. Rivera here, Detective. It's Tom Morrison. We have another situation. Ranger is alerting on a different guard. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. Then, what's the guard's name? Thompson's face had gone pale. This is harassment, he said, but he was backing toward the gate. I'm calling for backup, Thompson. Sarah called out Senior Corrections Officer Thompson, and detective you might want to check if he has any connection to Fort Braxton. The phone went quiet. Then Rivera's voice came back tight with excitement. Robert Thompson, former Master Sergeant 25th Infantry Division, he was stationed at Fort Braxton from 2017 to 2020. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. Thompson had been at Fort Braxton during the same period as Bradley. During the same period when Colonel Mitchell had been investigating the corruption ring. He was part of it. She breathed. He was part of the network. Mitchell was investigating. Thompson bolted for the gate, but Tom Morrison was faster than his 70 years, suggested the old veterinarian. Threw himself between Thompson and the exit, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Ranger didn't hesitate. Years of training kicked in, and he launched himself at Thompson with the speed and precision of the military weapon he'd once been. His jaws clamped down on Thompson's wrist, not to maim, but to restrain. The same technique he'd used hundreds of times to subdue suspects in Afghanistan. Call for backup, Sarah shouted, but Tom was already speaking rapidly into his phone. By the time state police arrived 10 minutes later, they found Thompson pinned beneath 65 pounds of very determined German Shepherd, while Sarah Blake provided a running commentary on proper suspect restraint techniques. The search of Thompson's quarters at the correctional facility revealed a treasure trove of evidence. Encrypted communications with Bradley dating back to before the murder, financial records showing unexplained deposits totaling nearly $200,000, and most damning of all, a detailed floor plan of the building where Colonel Mitchell had been killed. But the real breakthrough came when forensics examined Thompson's service weapon. Gunpowder residue tests revealed traces consistent with the ammunition used to kill Mitchell. Not the killing shot, but a second weapon that had been fired in the same room that night. Was Bradley's backup. Detective Rivera explained to Sarah during his evening briefing. They went in together. Bradley pulled the trigger, but Thompson was there to make sure the job got done and to help stage the scene to frame youth conspiracy. It was larger than anyone had imagined. Thompson had been recruited into the corruption network during his final years of military service, when mounting gambling debts had made him vulnerable to outside pressure. After his retirement, he'd taken the job at the correctional facility specifically to keep tabs on Sarah's case and to ensure she never got the chance to expose what she might have learned that night. He's been watching you for 5 years. Rivera continued, his voice heavy with the implications, making sure your appeals failed, that your lawyers didn't dig too deep into the military connection. When Ranger started exposing the truth, Thompson panicked. Sarah felt sick. How many others were involved? We're still uncovering the network. Bradley and Thompson have both agreed to cooperate in exchange for plea deals. So far, we've identified at least 12 military personnel and 6 civilian contractors involved in the scheme. The financial losses to the military run into the tens of millions. The scope of the conspiracy explained why Sarah's initial defense had been so ineffective. Key witnesses had been transferred or discharged before the trial. Evidence had been classified or lost. Her own commanding officers had been reluctant to testify on her behalf, not because they doubted her innocence, but because they'd been warned that the case involved national security issues. She'd been railroaded by people who needed her silenced, and she'd never even known it. What happens now? She asked. Now we finish building the case against everyone involved, Rivera replied, and we get you out of their butt. Even with confessions from both Bradley and Thompson, the legal process moved with agonizing slowness. Sarah's conviction had to be formally overturned, which required paperwork and hearings and judicial reviews. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself caught between hope and despair. The only thing that kept her sane was Ranger's visits. The dog seemed to understand that his mission was complete, but he refused to abandon his handler. During their twice-weekly reunions, he would lie beside Sarah in the prison yard, his head on her lap, as if to say, I'm not leaving you. Again he's lost. Wait, Tom Morrison observed during one visit, I think he's worried about you. Sarah stroked Ranger's graying muzzle, feeling the dog's steady breathing against her leg. I'm worried about him too. He's not young anymore, Tom. This stress can't be good for him. It was Linda Morrison who provided the solution. She appeared in the yard during their 6th week of visits, carrying a folder of paperwork and wearing the determined expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something. Sarah, she said without preamble, I've been researching therapy, animal regulations for correctional facilities. Sarah looked up confused. Therapy animals. Ranger is already a trained working dog with documented psychological benefits for his handler, Linda continued. Warming to her subject, there's precedent for allowing therapy animals to remain with inmates who are dealing with trauma or PTSD. Linda, I'm not sure the state is going to approve I've already spoken with Warden Hayes, Linda interrupted with a smile. She's willing to consider a temporary arrangement while your case is being resolved. Ranger would stay here with you. Sarah felt her throat close with emotion. I can't ask you to do that. He's your dog. Now you've taken care of him for 5 years, Tom. Morrison knelt beside them, his weathered hand joining Sarah's in stroking Ranger's fur. Sarah, we love this dog, but he's never been our dog. He's been waiting for you. We've just been keeping him safe until you could come home. The paperwork took another week to process, but eventually, Warden Hayes approved the arrangement. Ranger would be allowed to stay in the facility as Sarah's therapy animal with the understanding that the situation would be reevaluated once her legal status was resolved. Morning Ranger moved into the prison was surreal. Sarah watched through her cell window as Tom Morrison led the dog through the facility's main entrance carrying a bed, food bowls, and enough toys to stock a pet store. This is highly irregular, one of the guards muttered as they passed. So is executing innocent people, Warden Hayes replied curtly. The dog stays. Ranger's presence in the facility had an immediate impact that surprised everyone. Other inmates, women who had seen nothing but concrete and steel for years, would stop to watch him walk past. Some asked if they could pet him, and with Sarah's permission, Ranger seemed to understand his new role as an unofficial therapy dog for the entire cell blockies, giving them hope, Sarah explained. 2. Detective Rivera, during one of their regular calls. Some of these women haven't touched an animal in decades. He's reminding them that there's still gentleness in the world. But Ranger's most important function remained being Sarah's anchor to sanity. As the legal process dragged on at night, he slept on a blanket beside her cot. During the day, he accompanied her to meals, to recreation time, even to her meetings with lawyers, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sarah began to heal from 5 years of injustice. The breakthrough finally came on a Tuesday morning in late November. Detective Rivera called with news that made Sarah's hands shake as she held the phone. The DA has agreed to dismiss all charges, he said without preamble. You're free. Sarah, completely and officially free. Sarah sank onto her cot, Ranger immediately pressing against her legs in response to her emotional distress. When today the paperwork is being processed. Now you should be released this afternoon. After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence. 5 years and 8 months of imprisonment were about to end. She would walk out of this place a free woman, her name cleared, her conviction overturned. But freedom, she realized, was going to be almost as terrifying as captivity had been. The world had moved on without her. Technology had advanced, people had aged, life had continued while she'd been frozen in time. She had no home, no job, no possessions. Beyond the few items in her cell, she had nothing, except an aging German shepherd who had never stopped believing in her innocence. Ranger seemed to sense the momentous nature of the day. He was more alert than usual, his ears pricked forward, his eyes bright with anticipation when the guard came to escort Sarah to the warden's office for her release. Processing Ranger stood and shook himself as if preparing for a mission. Ready for this, boy? Sarah asked as they walked down the corridor for the last time. Ranger's tail wagged once, a confident acknowledgement. He was ready. He'd been ready for 5 years and 8 months. They were going home. Finally, they were going home.